about dingo population density and spatiotemporal relationships. So just click that manually. There with. Okay, great. So our study area is Myall Lakes, as I mentioned. We established this project in 2019. I wasn't part of that, I've come in years later. And it's a collaboration between the Centre for Ecosystem Science at UNSW and Taronga Conservation Society, New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service, and also the Mid-Coast Council. So there's a large group of people working towards learning more about dingoes in this area. If this area is at all familiar to you, it might be because a few years ago, another PhD student, Brendan Alting, came and he also presented. So he looked at population density and the behaviours of the dingoes in this black outlined area, which is Myall Lakes. In that area, we've also been doing, for the last couple of years, population density analyses. So as you can see here, we've been looking at how that population density is changing over time. Right now, we're seeing a decreasing trend. And this is a really valuable project because there are very few projects that have done these long-term trends of dingoes. We also know a lot about them. So for example, we'll know if there's an adult who's breeding right now, we'll know which pack she came from when she was born. We'll know where she dispersed to. We'll know who her mate is and where they came from. And this sort of information is actually really important, but traditionally is kind of neglected in dingo studies, in large part just because that's hard to do, particularly when they're in quite rural areas where it's really hard to sort of monitor them so extensively. But fortunately, because this is a lovely, lovely area and it's not too hard for us to go down every month, we're able to do that. Now, the difference here is that I'm looking at what we call the western side of Myall Lakes. So this is that red outlined area on the other side of the Pacific Highway. What makes this area really interesting is that these are two basically isolated populations. So on the east side, you're seeing classical sandy dingo. On the west side, we're seeing dingoes who are black or black and white or brown and sandy and white and a whole mix. And because of this Pacific Highway, there's really not a whole lot of transitions between the two populations. Also in this red area, there are some campsites, there are gravel roads, but that's the extent of it. In Myall Lakes, the eastern side, we have hawk's nest and seal rocks and tea gardens, and you have a whole lot more access to up the north. So what we're seeing is two very different exposures that dingoes have to humans and anthropogenic presence with a really short distance between them, but there's just not a whole lot of mixing between them. Ooh. Great, okay, so the point of my chapter is to do a multi-year camera survey to assess these trends in dingo population density in an area that we haven't yet assessed at all. No one knew what kind of dingoes were around in that area, besides from anecdotal evidence. We also want to investigate mesopredator suppression. So that's whether dingoes are suppressing other mesopredators like cats and foxes, either in their temporal behavior or possibly physically where they're going. We also want to look at the spatio-temporal relationships between dingoes, cats, and foxes. So maybe looking at things like, does moonlight change how this relationship exists between dingoes, cats, and foxes, or distance to certain habitats, or time since a dingo was seen on the camera, does that affect when a cat was seen or a fox was seen? And honestly, maybe many more. I'm in the beginning stages. I'm still in the data collection stage. So as a small spoiler, this isn't going to be a very results-heavy talk because that's going to come later down the line. And I imagine I'm going to come up with a lot of different questions along the way. If you think of anything interesting, let me know. I'm always open. So to begin, the workflow that we have starts with doing a site recce, so that's driving around, in my case, driving around with my supervisors as it got dark and rainy and the roads were terrible and everyone was getting very stressed. And then we move on to planning the camera placement. So then we're putting cameras out across the whole park, and you do that you have a duration deployment of 90 days. So it's a 3-month survey period where you have the cameras out and you're servicing them and regularly checking and changing the SDs and batteries and finding out if they're stolen and so on. And then that survey period is over, take the cameras down. Then a few months later, we go back up, put them back up. And we do that for 2 years. So that led to us having this sort of map. So now you can see this is the western side, and we've got these 20 different stations. So far, we've finished session 1, 2, and 3, and we've still got session well, session 3 is in progress right now, and session 4 will be done at the end of this year. And the main thing that I've taken away from this whole project is that I should probably get a chainsaw license, because we have seen so many downed trees, and that is all it takes for you to have your fieldwork day ended. You need to call in reinforcements, you need to get people to clear those roads. Also, roads just collapsing from one day to the next is another thing that I came up against many times. But as you can also see from these pictures, it is a beautiful, beautiful environment, and I feel really fortunate to be able to drive around there every day for a week, every month. Well, every month for 9 months of the year. So that has been really, really fun, and I've really enjoyed that. The next stage is the computer stage, and this is where things get a little bit more like square-eyed, just spending hours upon hours upon hours upon hours looking at images of dingoes. Again, not the worst thing in the world. So we start with renaming all the images, then we use an AI program to be able to do image recognition, which can separate, because you get thousands and thousands and thousands of photos. So this helps you separate what's animal, what's person, what's vehicle, and what's an empty image, which automatically far reduces the amount of time you have to spend. You still have to go through it, obviously, and check and make sure, but it makes lives much easier. And then we go through a process of dingo individual identification. So because we're doing this density analysis, the type of analysis we're doing requires you to have knowledge of which individual is which. You can't just say that's a dingo. You have to say that's Fox, or whatever you're going to name that dingo, which is a painstaking process, but ultimately is very valuable in the end. And so once you have all these dingo IDs, you can go through and you can tag every single image and say, that's a dingo and that's this dingo, and they're with this other dingo who's with that dingo. And that process of finding dingo IDs sort of looks like this. So you get images of dingoes. For example, this top one is WPS10, BRU2304, that's just his code name. We'll give him a real name. But you find them by their socks, largely, because they often have different lengths of socks. You can't really rely a whole lot on other things like coat color or their shape, because that will change over time. But you get where you consider this is like this image is going to represent this dingo, and then everything else, every other image you see, you're going to compare to that dingo, which is a long, long process. But eventually you get what's in the middle, which is sort of our catalog of photos for that individual. And I'll have many more photos than that, but we'll just have slides where we have, these are kind of the easiest to identify images of that individual from all different sides you can possibly get. And on the right here is an example of a different kind of coat colors. So in these cases, you can differentiate. I can tell the one who's black is different to the one who's sandy. That's not going to change. And that's the great thing about the West. You have so much variety. It does help you a little bit in making those distinctions. In the East, they all look the same. So we go through that whole process, and then you get to this next stage. And don't worry about all the words and everything, but this is something I made for myself, where I was saying, okay, if dingo A is seen with B, and B is seen with C, and C is seen with E, and E is seen with F, then F must be in the same pack as A. You go around in circles and circles and circles, and you do that until you get a good idea of which dingo packs have which individuals. And obviously it's difficult because dingoes are a fusion society, which means that they will establish packs, but often they're off on their own and they do their own hunting, and they'll just come together now and then, but the entire pack won't necessarily come together. So it's a real puzzle of getting who is who and who belongs with whom. But after you've done that whole process, then you can do something like this. You can create the pack. This is the Branch River pack, just based on the name of the river that was nearby. And you can get an idea of who the dominant males and females are, and also maybe who the other sub-adults who are just lingering around. And then also the ones who are clearly pups, who were clearly born last year. And so they must have been born to those two, or we assume. So from just having cameras out across the park, and every few months we go out and we service them, we take them back in, you can get a really good idea of who's around and what the packs look like and their structure. And that's all it takes. All of this I've shown you is from one session. That's from one 3-month session. So when you repeat that over and over again, you get a good idea of how that's changing over time as well. So ultimately, roughly 300 hours of driving in the field, about 12,000 dingo images processed manually by me, we eventually came to the conclusion that there are roughly 45 distinct individuals in this park, which is quite a lot, and 6 different packs identified, in addition to those solitary ones who don't appear to have a pack. So we've got the Kings Mountain pair, the Jarrah pack, Bryce River, and just based on where I'm seeing those individuals on what cameras, we can then get a vague idea of roughly where those packs exist. And that then helps you for the next survey, because you know, if I've seen an individual right up there, he probably doesn't belong to the pack that's all the way down there. So it's a very much an iterative process, and this is largely qualitative. There are more analysis you can do to actually get an idea of their home ranges and where they are and everything. But just from a 3-month survey, we've already got an idea of sort of how many dingoes are in what areas of the park, which is great. And that then helps you to move on to the next part, which is the actual analyses. I'll walk through some, they're pretty like preliminary basic analyses that I've done, because I haven't dived into the full in-depth one because I haven't actually finished with all the data collection. To start with, we looked at spatial and temporal overlap of dingoes, cats, and foxes. Those are our main interests because I'm sure, as you all know, they are very controversial animals. So, for example, the spatial overlap, finding that dingoes and foxes actually have the highest spatial overlap in terms of they're the ones who are overlapping the most of the same cameras. Even though you can see cats are across the entire region of the park, dingoes are too, foxes are in a much more concentrated area, but the places where they are most concentrated is also overlaps more with the places where the dingoes are most concentrated. And you got dingoes and cats, and then the lower spatial overlap is between foxes and cats. Now, this is, again, like I say, preliminary stuff, so I'm not going to make any grand conclusions from this, but this is the idea of what I'm going to look into in more depth and actually do the analyses, is sort of seeing what are the drivers, trying to more elucidate, okay, is this because they're just avoiding each other, or they're not really bothered about avoiding each other, or is this because there's certain habitats around the sites, maybe a certain farm or something that's more interesting, the dingoes and foxes? We'll see. And then looking at temporal overlap. So this is purely not where they are, but just when they are active. So we see that there is a highest overlap between foxes and cats, and then between dingoes and cats, and then between dingoes and foxes. Now, what's to note here is they all have very high overlap. They are distinctly different peaks in activity, but they do overlap quite a lot. So when it comes to thinking about whether the dingoes might be suppressing the activity of the cats and foxes, I think personally, in this area, that's probably not likely. And part of the question what we're looking into is this a density thing? Is that there isn't high enough density of dingoes? Or maybe there is just enough resources that dingoes don't need to be eating cats or preying on cats and altering their activity. They've got so much food around. Because ultimately, I think whether or not dingoes suppress cats or foxes is just not a one-size-fits-all answer, which I think oftentimes in literature is tried to be pushed as a simple, yes, they do, or no, they don't. I think it's just a nuanced question, and it depends on the context, and possibly in this specific context, that's just not happening, and let's try and figure out maybe why. So this is also our findings to correlate with other findings. I have found the same sort of overlap between dingoes and cats, with significant differences in activity peaks, but they do generally overlap in the same time of the night. So the next stage is density, and if you want to know about that, read my PhD when I finish it, because I'm not done with that analysis. That is the one that we're going to do once we have all of the different survey periods done, because we want to see how they're changing maybe over summers and over winters. We have all the data to do that. So in some part, it's a lack of all the data to do the density analysis, and in some part, because of what I call unexpected events. These haven't necessarily stopped us from being able to do the analyses, but these have complicated the analyses a fair bit, which means I've also not moved on to them yet, and I'm focusing on other chapters for now. So some of these unexpected events is cameras being stolen, big issue in national parks. you wouldn't assume people have the materials to break apart a camera or cut off a python lock or any of that in parks, but they really, really do, and they do not like the cameras being up. Um, it is just unfortunately the truth of what we have to experience. So we try to avoid this as much as we can. We have locks, python locks, we have cages and cameras often. We also set them up in very particular ways. The difficulty here is that because we want to get images of both sides of the dingo, they have to be low to the ground. They have to be, knee level height because we want to see the entire body. You can't have them nice up and high because you need to be able to see the socks. That means they're very accessible to people. We also need to have them on the road or on the trail because if you have, trees and vegetation and everything in the way, you're not going to get anything. You're going to get tens of thousands of images of grass. So they have to be on the trail. Again, makes them very obvious. So we have a method where we try to have them sort of set back a bit. We have to do a whole, can you see it from this direction? Can you see it from that direction? Having trees to block them, maybe sometimes putting bark around the sides to try and hide them. So we do what we can. Cameras do get stolen. This is why it's really helpful to have the Oatley grant in cases where you can't really prepare ahead of time for cameras being stolen because you don't know, especially in situations where we hadn't ever done any sort of monitoring in this park. We didn't know which areas were riskier. I soon found out when 4 of my cameras were stolen on one stretch of road. We avoid that road. I now know that. But that's just a trial and error sort of thing. So it's really helpful to have the money to be able to go and get more cameras. Then we had 2 other events that happened in quick succession. So in roughly November, I think, of last year, we found out that a handful of dingoes were lethally controlled in the park in the sort of southern area by the Pacific Highway. I'm not entirely sure why they were. We're not, we don't have any control over that or really get any information about that. But those dingoes were killed. And when it comes to density analyses alone, that's not going to be a massive problem. The density just goes down when more dingoes are killed. That will make sense. Fortunately, in December, we then had fires. I don't know if any of you heard, but in the Myall Lakes region, there were some horrible wildfires that ripped through. Homes are lost, a firefighter's life was lost, and they were pretty severe fires. They were in our area where we had cameras up. That, in fact, one of the cameras that survived, capturing a fire opposite the road that somehow kind of lit up and then went away. My camera survived, which was really nice. But that also makes things really tricky because now anything that we might once have attributed to the lethal management in terms of lowering density could also now be attributed to the fires. So those 2 things are now confounding each other, which means we can't separate them. And that's a problem for me in a few months when I come to the analyses. I haven't yet figured out how to, I haven't really figured out how we're going to get around that, but essentially it means there are some very unexpected events that happen in quick succession and has made our analysis a little bit harder. But I feel like I've kind of ended this on a negative tone, so that's the extent of the talk. I didn't want to belabor the points for too long, have a massive long talk. So I think we could take some questions now, and in the background, I can have some of my favorite camera trap photos of the animals that we've seen in the area. Thank you very much.
So do we have any questions? Yes, Sonia.
Oh, you're testing my memory. I am not. I don't know. I did know this.
You have any kilometers?
No, can I find out and I get back to you? Because I could say something embarrassingly wrong right now, but I've not actually worked with this data for a good 6 months. But I will get back to you.
It's really good. It's got the line straight down. And there's that pretty bit just on the left hand side of it.
I'll get a map up.
That area as well. That where I would have thought there would have been dingoes wandering sort of in and out.
Is this, let me find your map.
I mean, the very beginning with the 2 groups.
It looks like there's a
This map?
no, the other one.
The next map.
topographic.
Isn't that?
Isn't that one way to actually show the bushiness of the field? The sort of L-shaped cutout.
Well, this like black line is the national park. Everything outside of that is agricultural land, private property, which we do not have permission to be putting up any camera traps or any support. Basically everywhere, like this whole portion here, where we don't have cameras, is entirely because the roads aren't good enough. The idea was to get cameras across the whole grid. It's like the gridded camera setup, so they're not just like randomly put. They're purposely put in centroids of a grid of squares and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then you have to move them to where you actually have access. And there's a whole portion of that park, the roads just are undrivable, and so you can't put cameras up there. But everywhere else where the cameras are is in the national park. Everything outside of that is agricultural fields, which would be very interesting if we could get permissions to also put cameras up there, but that's a whole other little fish.
Do you have any trouble defining a dingo, and are there wild dogs in the area?
It's a really good question. As far as my work, we don't really make the distinction, but there has been genetic research done by Callie Cairns in the area, not with these specific dingoes, but with dingoes in this area and also in the eastern side. And from a genetic analysis, they're largely very pure dingoes. There aren't really many wild dogs in this area specifically, but also just for the purposes of this project, we don't really see necessary to distinguish between wild dogs and dingoes. In terms of wild dogs, is like, you know, if you conceive of them as essentially the same as dingoes, but genetically slightly different, or a mix or something, not just feral domestic dogs. We don't make that distinction. Robin?
Show in the beginning a lot of different colour variation. Now, with the pack, how varied is the genetic material in each pack? Are they all the packs similar colours, or are they very mixed up?
Yeah, that's a great question that I also asked Kylie Cairns because I wanted to know whether I could use that as a sort of, oh, well, this dingo's black and that other dingo's black, so that must be the father of that dingo, or something along those lines. And she said it's very complicated. She said you cannot really distinguish parentage or something by the colours because some confusing genetic babble about, like, you know, recessive genes of I think the black coat color is like recessive gene, and you can basically, I think, have a black dingo have a sandy offspring, which makes things very confusing. And the genetics of it, I do not understand. I am not a geneticist, but I do know it's not a homogeneous sort of, they're all the same color. You see a lot of mixture. You will see black pups next to sandy pups, and they must have come from the same parents. So it's, but interestingly, on the eastern side, it's for the large part sandy, sometimes slightly brown, but that's the extent of it. You'd never see any black or brown dingoes. And that's probably because there isn't like this sort of genetic transfer between the western side and the eastern side. They are two very separate populations. Scott?
So we're looking at the new arrival in Australia. Do you know how long
Dingoes? I think the conservative estimate is between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago, which is a big range. But it's not something that we know for certain, like the exact timing. But that's what, like, the most conservative range I've read is 5,000 and 10,000 years ago.
they must have come from north?
Yeah, they come from Asia. Yeah, they came on boats of traders. That's the presumption. They came on boats of traders, and yeah. Scott, this time.
So the dingoes, feral cats, foxes
Yeah.
seem to coexist, but in police evidence, dingoes attacking foxes or cats.
No, I mean, it certainly happens. It's like there is certainly, like, cats and foxes can be prey of dingoes. A lot of things can be prey of dingoes. Dingoes will eat anything. But I think in this case at least, cats and foxes are probably trickier prey than like a goanna or maybe like a wallaby. And so in these cases, I don't think there is much evidence that the dingoes are predating on cats and foxes to such an extent that it's affecting their behavior. In other studies, they have found that where you have dingoes, you have suppression of cats or suppression of foxes. But I don't think there's evidence for that in this particular study. I've never seen it on camera, but our cameras are just photos, so we're not going to really see predation events anyway. But yeah, I think this is just such there's probably so much rich prey resource in this park anyway, that they don't really need to go through all of the effort for cats and foxes. Dingoes ultimately take the path of least resistance. That's why we have cameras on the trails. And I think that will hold true as well for prey items. James.
Along there,
So there is WPS7, this is up there. That, for example, is near a campground called Strike a Light Campground. But the roads in this park aren't very well managed. And so for example, that road itself, worst road in the world, I hate it. Full of like heavy crevices and you don't want to drive down it after rain, any of that sort of thing. So generally speaking, I think those campgrounds are only really used by, intense four-wheeler drivers. It's not the kind of place that your average, family will go to. So there's not that much like human dingo interactions. I mean, in the eastern side, at Stuart and Lloyd's campsite, there's a pack who live there. You could go today and go to that campground and see dingoes. They will just be hanging around. They're not bothered. You go to the west, I've been going there for 2 years now. I've never once seen a dingo. And I've also been, there's sometimes driving through, so obviously they'll hear it and run away, but I've also had to go on walks, for an hour or two, never seen a dingo, even though on the cameras we see one 20 minutes later walk past. So they're far more averse to humans in this area than they are to the east area, which I think speaks to the fact that there just aren't that many humans around. And it's not the sort of place where people often are just like hiking around. It's probably cars, which the dingoes are getting out of the way of. And it's different vegetation as well, like scrubby immediately, like the road's scrubby, so they can easily hide away. Yes, up the back.
What does the bait?
I think it's, what's the local land services? They're pest control people essentially. I think there's basically a governmentally mandated level of control that has to be done. Myall Lakes is very good for sort of not doing that excessively. They are the people that we work with in Myall Lakes in the parks are very supportive of what we do and supportive of the dingoes being there. But there's also like a baseline level of baiting that by law has to happen. I assume that's what was happening here. I don't know why these individuals were targeted. I don't think they're particularly causing any threat to any individuals. They're not, going across the roads. So I imagine it must just be some baseline level had to happen. I don't know why it happened. I think it's a bit unfortunate, but it's not really my. Sorry? This one was targeted for the dingoes. But yeah, I mean, they do 1080 also for the foxes and everything. There is like general 1080 stuff that happens, but this was a targeted, like traps out to the dingoes. So we also do trapping, but it's not for killing, it's just for putting collars on. We're checking the traps every few hours. So you put a trap out and then you check it every like 3 hours, basically. And we never caught a fox, but we've caught like a cat, for example. Because you can't really distinguish what happens. Basically, you can have traps where when they go on, they step on the like plate underneath because they're going to get the meat that's in the trap. It will be set to a certain weight. So if you're above a certain weight, you're going to set the trap. If you're below it, you're not. So ideally, you're not catching poles and whatnot. But I don't think you can necessarily be easily that discriminatory between dingoes and foxes. So I don't know. I don't think you can really. I think it's just a matter of going and seeing what you've got. And yeah. Okay, Adrian? Really.
What's your expectation once you finish your research and the outcomes? How would you see the results of that being used in a logical manner?
Yeah, good question. Well, part of it is just adding to a body of literature. I'm not sure how familiar you all are with the whole mesopredator suppression subject when it comes to dingoes, but it's quite a contentious subject. There's a lot of studies that say they do it, and a lot of studies that say they don't do it, and they're often in direct opposition or in direct response to one another. And I think what's needed is a little bit of just, well, let's just take a context-specific approach to this. In certain areas, they may do it. In other areas, they may not do it. And that's the kind of evidence that we should be gathering, not so much like dingoes are useless, they don't suppress cats and foxes, or dingoes are useful, they do. I don't see that as being particularly useful. So ideally, this specific part would just be looking to add to a body of evidence where we can say, look, we actually looked at density of dingoes. Oftentimes these studies are looking more at just abundance. What's the number of dingoes? Whereas we're looking at what's the number of dingoes relative to the area, because that's likely to have more of an important impact on whether they are doing this sort of suppression than just what's the number of dingoes. So part of it is adding to the body of literature with a little bit more of a robust and longer term data set and like form of analyses. Part of it is also just the ecological benefit of knowing what are the drivers that are affecting how dingoes, cats, and foxes are interacting. So later on down the line, it's sort of very like baseline level information, so that down the line, ideally, the type of thing that the MLDP, our group, is going for is, if we have to do management of dingoes, let's do targeted management. Let's do evidence-based management of dingoes. And to do any sort of evidence-based management, you really do need that like really fundamentals level of information of what are the drivers, what are the things that are causing them to act the way they do. And so that's the sort of research that I'm doing, where it's really just, trying to get that like the fundamental information so that later on, when we start to come up with targeted interventions, they can be based on more extensive knowledge around how dingoes are going to respond and how other species are going to respond to dingoes, and to whatever interventions we want to place on them. So it's a bit of a cop-out answer because it's just, I'm getting the fundamentals, I'm getting the basic stuff in. It's less maybe interesting than like a direct management kind of study, like if you're using ultrasonics to deter dingoes, which another PhD student in MLDP is doing, which is also very interesting. But yeah, it's sort of fundamentals. Thank you.
Marie wants to know what makes a good dingo meal, and do they look like it?
What makes a good dingo meal? Dingoes love everything. Dingoes, they eat a whole wide range of prey, which is part of the reason why dingoes can be seen in the sort of, they can be seen in arid regions, they can also be seen in Kosciuszko Mountains. They're able to exist in so many different environments because they'll just eat what's there for them. They'll eat lizards, they'll go fishing, they'll go into the water and take fish. There's a picture of some dingoes eating washed up whale. They'll go into bins and eat humans like their trash. And they'll also hunt down kangaroos. It depends also on which region they're in, based on what they like more. So they might, in some regions, they might prefer wallabies. In other regions, they might prefer like little rodents and lizards and everything. So dingoes are the least pickiest eaters ever. And also, so these dingoes are healthy. The difficult thing with dingoes is they look very skinny. You can often see their ribs. And I think that's often why people end up feeding them, because they worry, oh no, this dingo is not doing too well. That's just naturally how they are. They are just very sort of slender animals. I can't guarantee that every dingo that we're going to see is healthy, because sometimes they get some sort of disease or whatever. But by and large, the dingoes that we've seen have been very healthy, and they just also go through waves. Sometimes if there's been like heavy rains or something, and now there's abundance of little critters, they get fattened up, and then maybe if there's been a drought or something, they'll slim down. But they're really very, very robust, very flexible, and very fond of eating whatever they can.
Do you know how many they have in a litter?
That's a good question. Again, so fundamentals. We often don't know this basic stuff. I think you might see. We've seen like litters up to 7 dingoes, maybe 7 or 8 dingoes. They don't always survive. They don't always survive for a range of reasons. Obviously, in like more urban areas, that's going to also be based on human things. But yeah, you can see litters of just 2. But I would say probably, I think the max we've seen is maybe 8 pups. And yeah, I mean they can, and then also they'll breed once a year, but you can keep going and going and going. We've got one individual called Socks who lives up at Stuart Moy's campsite, the oldest, raggiest looking dingo you have ever seen. Every time you see her, you think she's on her last legs. And then all of a sudden she's pregnant and she's popping out more pups. And she's been doing that year after year after year. So they can reproduce a lot.
And do you think overall the population's growing?
That's a good question. So in the east, it looks like the population is going down. I don't know if you saw that graph, but we found that the density is going down, and we want to investigate that. It's hard to tell whether that's a sort of an exodus, they're more just moving up north, if they're just dispersing more. And so where we have our cameras, because we keep cameras in the same place every year for reproducibility, whether those cameras just aren't capturing where they are, so we're getting less individuals. But we also suspect there could be some element of just dingoes getting shot and it's not being reported and we're not finding out about it. So in the east side, we can see that they are going down. The west side, TBD, because we've only just started that analysis, I would imagine, save for any sort of lethal management that's happening, they're probably stable. I wouldn't see any reason, just because they're less, if they're staying within the national park, they're just less exposed to going across, farmers' fields and getting shot or whatever ends up happening, less exposed to getting hit by cars and, getting diseases from other dogs or, that's the hope. I don't know, we're going to find out.
So is the dingo a separate species or is it subspecies?
That is the big question. That's a question that scientists can't agree on. People who have dedicated their lives studying dingoes can't agree on. There is currently, I think the IUCN defines them as Canis lupus dingo, so not Canis familiaris, which is the domestic dog. They're sort of prior to that, Canis lupus dingo. There are some dingo scientists who call them Canis familiaris dingo or just Canis dingo. So even just the scientific name isn't agreed on. Again, that more goes down to the genetics and goes right over my head, but it's one of the biggest questions around dingoes, and it also defines their entire debate, because if they are, to put it very simply, if they are sort of seen as Canis lupus dingo, that means that they are, a separate species with their own value and everything. If they are just Canis familiar, if they are just wild dogs, that sort of terminology is more used by the government when it comes to, well, they're not really doing a whole lot, like they're not true dingoes. It justifies their lethal management. So just the defining of what a dingo it is itself, very controversial. So you can't really take a step into the dingo world without annoying people, without saying the wrong thing, because it's a complicated question and it's an even more complicated answer, I'm afraid.
There are some dingo theories and those who want to
I wouldn't. Well, no, I wouldn't. I understand why people do. My understanding is that if, say, a dingo gets hit by a car and is taken to the vet, because dingoes are classified as pests, I believe they can't be released back into the environment. They're not allowed to be released back into the environment. You're not allowed to do that. So where do they go? They have to now be taken into like domestication. They have to be taken in. So I can understand why people are doing it, because there is no other option for that dingo. I don't think they would be a good house pet though. I think they might be quite difficult. They are a wild animal. If they've been taken from the wild, already having lived in the wild, I imagine it might be quite difficult to house train them. People do, And, you know, all power to them if they can handle that. I personally could not handle that. And I also think there's questions about, you know, where did that dingo come from? Has that dingo been forced into this, or, you know, have they been rescued? Yeah, that's also a complicated question. Up the back, on the left. Okay.
But the question, I know that you know the you know, when to grab land, take land, and make that your own land and have grazing animals, that you go through seem to be very complicated attack in grazing animals. I imagine that's where the concept of the came in. But you say we're still classified as pet. How is that? Do you see that very contentious area too?
Yeah. So they are still seen as pests, I believe, partly also because they do eat native animals, and in some camps they are not considered native to Australia because they came 5,000-10,000 years ago. In the grand scheme of things, that's not native. Now the question is, at what point are we saying something is native and not native? But that is one of the arguments. So they've been introduced into Australia. They eat native wildlife, you know, they predate on them. They are an apex predator, and they consume livestock. On the other hand, they also have been evidence to reduce kangaroos and the effect of kangaroos, because kangaroos can have really bad effects on vegetation when the populations are out of control. In some cases, there has been evidence that dingoes can suppress cats and foxes, who also have very bad impacts on the environment. So there's sort of two sides to the story. I think in large part they do have an impact on livestock, and obviously that's going to be a massive industry that is going to have a lot of control in that, whether that be right or not. And in fairness, like, I think there probably does need to be some extent of management of dingoes. If we want dingoes and humans to live together, that's just going to have to happen some way or another, whether that be lethal or targeted, whatever. Whether that's going to change, I think it's difficult. There are a group of, there was an Indigenous group who've taken all the way up to court, or to the High Court, to try and get the dingoes changed to be considered or to be protected. I don't know what's going on with that. I don't know like how that's progressed. I think that's just going to be a really long-term process if there are any changes. But to be honest, I think it's hard. They have an image problem. Dingoes do have an image problem, and they have had an image problem for a very long time. And the fact that they are wild, and the fact that incidents do happen, they do eat livestock, isn't going to help that. There is just more nuance to the whole story, and that is quite difficult to get through to everyone. So hopefully I'm not a pessimist. I wouldn't like to think I'm a pessimist, but I don't know. I don't know whether much is going to happen on the dingo front. But there is really good work. I mean, in New South Wales, they're protected in national parks, and often at times it comes down to just the people in parks. And if you're lucky enough, like we are, to work with some amazing people in parks who are very supportive and encouraging, and they also want to learn about the dingoes, not to, to get rid of them, but in order to help the dingoes and the humans coexist. You can have like pockets of healthy populations of dingoes where both can sort of exist at the same time. And as long as you have the research continuing to keep learning about what the dingoes are doing, where they're going, how they're being affected by things, I think that's the second best option if we can't get them protected overall. Also because it differs by state. Just to add some more complexity to the problem, each state has their own way of seeing things, and so you're not going to get necessarily a wide agreement, unfortunately. No.
Yeah, one of the stats that showed earlier was, I believe that you count 45 individuals in that area, which to me, I was surprised. To me, that's been low. Or lower than I expected. Do you feel that if, hypothetically, the foxes and the cats were gone, that would go up a lot, or that just don't have a large sustainable population of doves in the area?
Well, I think part of it, I don't think cats and foxes going would necessarily change things. Oh, actually, I go to the next slides. Just to show you the home ranges, because dingoes can have quite large home ranges, and the packs are really only going to be so large. So as you can see here, we've already got 6 packs throughout this area. And like, for example, this pack, which is the Kelly Creek pack, they sort of take up this entire area down here. And packs don't really overlap very much. You know, they might occasionally be seen at the same camera stations, but they have pretty defined territories and they will roam those territories. And the packs don't get massive. You know, you might have like, because you have the pups, but the pups will grow up and then the pups often disperse out. So you're not getting big packs. So ultimately, actually, I mean, I was pretty happy with 45 just because with how large these territories are. Oh, I see who was talking, yeah, about this area being still forested, but yeah, that's outside of the park boundaries. With how large those pack territories are, you can actually only have so many, and 45 is, I think it's more than we're seeing in the eastern side this year. Like they had a healthier population than we were seeing on the eastern side. So yeah, I mean, again, there isn't a whole lot of like existing research of this type. A lot of existing research is in arid areas, dingoes, and that's just a much bigger home ranges, much bigger area because this is quite a constrained area. We've got agriculture on sort of either side, which likely has fencing and likely has other things that are going to be deterring dingoes. And then you have Pacific Highway down the other end, and then you have other pack territories around. It's actually pretty limited areas that the dingoes are going to be inhabiting. So I don't think it's terribly surprising, to be honest, to see that number of individuals, and that will change. You know, that's going to fluctuate with those going out and those coming in. Yeah.
So you don't think that those numbers will increase by a large amount if the competition from gas and foxes for food was
I don't necessarily think it would, to be honest, because dingoes do get sort of kicked out of their packs. When they're sub-adults, they often then have to leave their packs. So you're not necessarily going to get like a much higher density in this area. Let's say for whatever reason the dingo population goes up, I think it would be more dingoes dispersing out of this park entirely. It wouldn't be them staying in the park. So you probably wouldn't see this massive rise in density of dingoes in this area because you're just going to reach a critical mass where there's just too many fights and they have to sort of leave. But yeah, I also think, and this is just a presumption based on the like initial data, I don't think they're resource limited. So I don't think the cats and the foxes are really like stopping the dingoes from being able to eat more. And so I don't think if you like got rid of the cats, the dingo population would suddenly explode because they're like released from this limitation. Yeah.
It seems like a pretty lush part of the so there's obviously a lot of resources around.
I think so, yeah. And also, they are bordered by agriculture. I don't know, but it could be they also have livestock available to them. I don't know whether that's true or not. Yeah, I mean, also just from the camera traps alone, like we see such a variety of species, and the dingoes have, you know, there's a pack of like 10, I think I was in like 2 adults and like 8 pups that was seen, and those pups have grown up. And I don't think you could really maintain that sort of pack if you were living in like a resource scarce environment. So I think they're probably doing pretty well for themselves.
Yeah, just in terms of the processing, what sort of time saving you made through this AI in processing?
Oh, enormous amount. Yeah. Because you still have to, obviously you're still checking it. So there is like a whole manual process, but you can now, instead of just looking at all the images and go through every single image, you can now say, okay, all of these images are supposedly empty images. There's no animals in it. And then you, using a specific program for time lapse, you can zoom out of the photos and get like a whole range of photos. It's just a quick check. Yeah, all clear. Super quick check because you know what you're expecting to see. And then with the animal ones, it's the same sort of thing. You can just zoom out and it'll have like a bounding box around the animal as well, so you can immediately draw your eye to where the animal is. It can see them at nighttime. Often it can even see them before you spot them. You know, you can look at an image without that bounding box and say, I don't think there's an animal here, and it'll show you, oh, there's a tiny lizard down there. So it's really good. There's also further programs that you can use where they are like models where they've actually been able to identify to species level, to say it's a dingo or it's a kangaroo or it's a wallaby. We don't use that because we're trying to keep the method consistent, and that wasn't available when we started. But that would also speed things up a lot. So yeah, it's great.
We have a question on Zoom from Janine. What percentage of the area was impacted by the bushfire?
Oh yeah, so it's basically WPS20 on the far right, everything south of Coral Road, which is sort of that choke point between the upper and the bottom part. Everything south of that was where the fire was, but it was mainly WPS20, which is the far right. WPS 18, 16, 15, the pictures I showed up with the burnt trees was from WPS 17, that bottom left camera station. So basically that whole area had some sort of fire impact, but the heaviest fires were on the right side, and that's where we lost cameras. Cameras were burnt.
Is that bottom area with the blue squares?
Yes, exactly. The bright blue and the pink squares. That was the area. But it was mainly the right side of sort of that road. 2018, 15, that was most impacted. That was where the fire sort of began, I think.
Were they arsenic or were they?
I don't know. I think they might have just been natural. Yeah, I'm not too sure, but it was a very big fire. Like it went all the way into the neighboring Bulahdelah town. But there was also a fire in January as well when we went back. There was a fire not in the same area, just across the Pacific Highway. I think that area is just it is prone to fires in the summer, especially.
Was there one more question here? Yes.
So you mentioned so many interesting facts about the people. So how do you usually start your research? I mean, you have all these questions in mind that you want to answer.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so with density analysis, it's a tricky one because the way that you lay out the camera, the question you're asking is sort of the question that you're able to answer is based on how you laid out the cameras. For example, we're looking at dingoes, so we lay out the cameras in a particular way. But laying out cameras like that means we can't look at cat density, we can't look at fox density because we don't have a high enough density of cameras to do that. The density of cameras fits the dingo question. So there is an element of you have to know what you want to learn in order to know how you're going to do what you're going to do. So you can't really just like put the cameras out and then say like, all right, let's ask some questions. So there is some element of a lot of like planning beforehand, and it helped that we have this eastern side that we've done since 2019 analyses. So we already had a protocol in place, and the idea is we're just going to do what we did there for the West, and that means later on we could also do some comparisons. They're so close to each other, but such distinct environments and like pressures that the dingoes are facing. So yeah, there's definitely an element of like pre-planning, but I am just the kind of person who, once I've got all my data, I start thinking, oh, but I can also do this, which I'm not meant to do, but I will be doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned before the areas around the whole network. Do you intend on how to integrate yourself into balance?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would like to. It's not something that we've floated. I don't know how interested they are, but I think it would be nice to, at the very least, know that, whether they're interested in knowing about the dingoes, considering that they're basically neighboring the properties. I don't know what kind of relationship we have with them, if any, but I would like to. I think ultimately you can't do anything related to dingoes without it being related to humans. Like those two things go hand in hand. And I think I would like to know at the very least whether they are, whether they're interested in what we're doing or if they're very like, I don't care, get them off my property, because that alone is going to affect whatever future, whatever future value we can get out of this research is going to be dependent on the people around who are actually being affected by it. So we haven't put that in place, but it's something that I'd really like to do.
Thank you. Brilliant question. Brilliant answer. Could I now ask Sue to thank you so much for tonight?
My pleasure. Take this on.
Thank you so much for telling us more about dingoes. It's fascinating information, and clearly it's interesting to a lot of people. Thank you so much. This is
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Briefly explain the biodiversity of a foreshore planning proposal currently on exhibition by Georgia River Council and why community submissions are so important. Overall, support this proposal in its entirety. We represent an important step towards strengthening protection for biodiversity, tree canopy and scenic landscape along the George River. The proposal includes several positive measures. These include new biodiversity objectives and mapping stronger scenic foreshore protections, and the introduction of green corridors to improve wildlife habitat connections. It also includes local character statements and updated landscaping and design provisions to ensure that development better respects the natural environment and the visual character of our suburbs. They are expanding the FSBA into other areas of the LGA, such as Oakley East and Connors Point. Larger lots help protect mature trees, wildlife habitat, and the unique leafy garden suburb character that our community values. They also help reduce overdevelopment in areas with steep topography and high scenic value, particularly along the river corridor. Because of the housing shortage, the LMR, as we know, the Department of Planning has asked Council to justify the larger lot sizes to be retained in the previous FSBA.
Sorry, James, I can't get the text and the link to this.
Anyway, while we understand the need to increase housing supply, this must not come at the expense of biodiversity, tree canopy and the scenic landscape of the George River. Our community has already made it very clear during previous conversation, I think 2021, this time, 5 years ago it was.
You probably see it there, I can't get it to work here.
That larger lot sizes should be retained. In particular, it is important that we protect larger lot sizes in Oakley West, Morto Heights, Peepers Heights, and Lugano. These are contained significant tree canopy, biodiversity, habitat, and strong connection to the river landscape. We also support councils expanding the green suburbia. If I get the map up, I'll show you. Naturalistic planning controls into areas removed from the foreshore scenic protection area to ensure these landscapes remain protected. In short, it's about finding the right balance. Off supports the proposal because it strengthens environmental protection, but we must also ensure that larger lots are retained where they are necessary to protect our natural environment and local character. The most important thing residents can do right now is make a submission. Submissions close at 5 p.m. on 30th of March 2026. So look, I think the submissions date was ending on the 23rd, but we got a week extension to the 30th now. So what we'll do, we haven't really discussed it, but we'll actually have a meeting or get together with a committee, and we might do a flyer, or we're in the mix of doing a flyer with a barcode, ready-made submission to help you, and you just add your little personal twist to it. Yeah? Do everyone get that?
James, what's the goal here? How many submissions do I achieve?
Well, we need at least 500. So we really need to, look, I think council's done their best, but because of the state government, they're watering down, and because Graham can't get the thing up, I'll have a look at my maps. Like I did this just at the back. So Oakley West is the larger lots, which could go to, if they do take the larger lots away and put them down to smaller lots, like places like, Myrtle Street, Milo Street, Myall Street, Gunga Bay Road, all those areas, you're going to see duplexes. Do you know what I mean? They're going to be like, or what do you call them? Those manor houses, I think, Kim? Yeah, manor houses, or and terraces. So there goes our tree country. That's Oakley, and then you've got Oakley West. So Loy Street, Douglas Bay, okay, Street, Bay Road, all those areas. Okay, Oakley Park Avenue, all those areas again. So we need to keep those larger lots there too. Morto Heights, all the B streets. I don't know. Do I need to tell you? Ballantyne, all the B streets in Morto Heights. That's a really small area. The roads are very tight. So to have more duplexes, more cars, it's going to be chaos. And then you've got Pecos Heights, where Lorraine Street, Cliff Avenue, Sunshine Avenue, Bayview Road, Vista Avenue. Damn, my first talk, and I.
So James, what you're saying is that we've got 40 people here. You can ask 10 things, or you can ask 10 of your friends. We can get up to 400 submissions straight away.
Yeah, look, it's up to us to actually, because the government wants the council to justify why do we want the larger lots and why do we want, why don't we want, to make them smaller lots and so forth. So if we get the submissions in and I've got.
So, trying to clarify.
Yeah.
The larger lots as are, but the government wants to decrease the lot size. So our submission would say we want it to be satisfied. Is that correct?
Your submission will be like this. I'll give you an example. So short submission from members and community. I support the biodiversity and foreshore planning proposal prepared by George River Council. The proposal is an important step to protecting biodiversity, tree canopy and the scenic landscape of the George River. I support the proposal in its entirety and encourage the government to retain larger minimum lot sizes, particularly in the Oakley West, Morto Heights, Pecos Heights and Lugano. That's all you have to say. And you can put your twist on it because you live there or whatever because you've got your backyard. I also support George River Council expanding Ghana suburbia,
I just can't get it to work.
And I had to show you this, but I can't now. I should have bought my maps. Anyway, Ghana suburbia. So, if you can't see my phone, can you?
Sorry. Well, you can turn this around.
Anyway, so look, the Ghana suburbia. So look, can I go to the other map?
No, fashioned.
Can I go to the other?
So I get a bit bigger.
No, it's going to be online. We're going to put it on Facebook, on the newsletter, and we're going to actually do maybe a street store or maybe a mailbox, a letterbox shop, just to remind everyone and all that. We're going to be, ramping up, if that makes sense.
So can you give us that blurb so we can, sort of copy it? Or?
I will, don't worry. It's going to be on a barcode, so you just put your phone on it, tweak, and then write whatever.
And this is keeping the current FSPA.
No, can I back to the other one? So the other FSPA from the red one. Okay, so look, I'll just try to go with this one. Oh, sorry, no. So the old FSPA goes all around here, right? So you can't see, but Lloyd's, this is Peakers Heights, Mortale Heights, Oatley West, right? So all that was the old FSBA. So all that area there now is taken out. So we could have justified why we need to keep the large lots. And we're telling council, see that green blob there, the green blobs? We want them to expand the Garmin suburbia naturalist, what do you call it, to make it come all the way up to here. So where the old FSBA was, we want them to put the Garmin suburbia naturalist in that area. So even though we've lost the FSBA, we want them to put the Garmin suburbia. So there's going to be more controls on there. So in other words, if someone wants to take a tree down or whatever, so the controls all still stay the same, but there'll be some more, planting, if that makes sense, more green corridors.
Together, what we originally put to state government was not bad. What is going to make them accept this?
Because of the LMR, they want all the larger lots taken away because they want, housing. So if you take larger lots away, you build duplexes. More. You put like 2 people or 3 people or 4 people on one land, opposed to have one, a couple or a family on a big land. Do you mean? Makes sense? Am I explaining that right?
So, what a good thing for people to do if they want to is to get on Google Maps and look at Street View. There'll often be Street View images from Middle Harbour looking to the headlands, and I'm there to work well. And it's a good example of what will happen here, because you've got sparse greenery and 3 rows of houses right down. So if the lot sizes have changed, then you'll be able to build, a house on what is now the lower bush part of the block.
If that comes through, if you stand on the top of Bedrick and look towards Oatley West, all that green cover will go. Don't look nice on you, but all those big trees, they'll disappear. Because when you build a duplex, they start from a blank canvas, so they get rid of all the,
It'll look like the Southern Shire side. Yes. Yes, it does.
Sorry, say again. It does, yeah, but the problem is when you do 3 stories up, where are you going to plant a tree when they're building it from the back to the front, left to the right? Have you seen the house that they build now and the 3 stories up they build now? They pretty much take the whole land up. Yeah. And then when they put a street tree at the front, it miraculously dies. And then council, you tell them, oh look, there's a dead tree. Oh, we can't catch up. We can't enforce that. We're understaffed, whatever.
Is this happening Sydney-wide now?
Absolutely.
That's why before shore scenic protection area is sort of a bit unusual.
Yeah.
Can you go to the other map?
Yeah. Marie?
So just look at that.
We're meeting with council, but I want to speak for you, but the blocks are 650 square metres and the aim is to move to 450.
Correct.
So if you think about that, you can visualise the difference. So basically, with 2 blocks together, you've got 3,000 instead of 2.
So that's the old FSBHs there. Do you see that big chunk there? That's all gone now.
We can put that on the website.
Yeah. Look, you'll get a mailbox. I don't know. We're going to discuss still what we're going to do, but I think we're going to do what we did in 2021. We're going to do big mailbox. I think maybe some street stores, whatever. We'll see how we go because we're a bit underman, underwoman, so we'll try our best. Hey, underperson. So look. Yeah, look, I think if we get those submissions through and we just show the land environment that we're still feeling the same way as we did in 2021, they'll go, that's justified. But if we send them 5 submissions, mind you, I have been getting a lot of people to call, and Anne Quinn has been like, oh, you've been telling people to call me. I'm like, maybe just a little bit. So she's been getting a lot of phone calls. However, we need this on paper submissions to send it for her for council to just justify that we as a community still remain the same way. We still are the same way as we were in 2021. Makes sense, yeah. Thank you. Oh, sorry, 30th of March. So it's 23rd, but now it's 30th of March.
It's been extended for 1 week.
Yeah. So, John, we'll get something before, what are we now?
16.
Yeah, we'll get something before the 20th.
It's 2 weeks away.
Yeah, so we'll get something out there before the 20th. We'll figure out what we're going to do, and we'll start,
On the similar note, Kim is going to be interviewed by NBC Radio to NBC about this topic. But we don't know exactly when it's going to go to air because it's pre-recorded. So when we find out when your interview is going to go to air, we could maybe quickly send out an email to everyone so we can all tune in.